Welcome, everyone. My name is Laura, and my pronouns are she and hers. I'm a member of this event organizing team, and I'll be moderating along with Catherine here for this session. I want to make sure that everyone is aware as we start that live transcription is available. If you go down to the bottom of your screen in that menu bar, you should be able to press on the closed captioning. Or it's sometimes called subtitles, and it should work for you. I would just like to start off by saying that we are very excited to have this amazing group of panelists here. We will go through their presentation, and we might potentially have questions at the end, but otherwise they have offered to share their information. So if you do have any questions, keep them in mind. So in dreaming of this event, our team was inspired by words adopted from Project NIA. Abolitionist futures are not compatible with white supremacy, settler colonialism, misogyny, heterosexism, transphobia, ableism, and classism. Yet these systems of oppression are all around us and affect even this event space. The hope our team has for this session is that organizers, presenters, and participants, particularly those of us who carry a lot of privilege, are mindful of the differential impacts of power and have the courage to hold to account anyone here who exercises power in a way that enacts harm. So if one of our organizers does remove you from this session, our intention is not to punish nor to exclude you, but to practice care for the abolitionist community we are building. So with that being said, Catherine, I'll leave it to you to introduce yourselves.
Thank you very much, Laura. If I just could share my screen with you and hope that this works. Yeah, can we see that? Great, fantastic. Okay, thank you very much for that that brief introduction, Laura, and I'd like to extend our welcome as well as a group from England and Wales in the UK, and to welcome you to this, what we've called a roundtable event. I think when we thought about it afterwards, we wondered whether that was the right term, as we're obviously not sitting around a table, but hopefully one day we will be able to do that and to share our experiences in person with you all. I'd also like to thank the organisers for accepting our session. We weren't sure whether it would be something that you would be interested in, and we're absolutely delighted that we have been invited to come along and to present to you today. What we want to do over the next hour is to focus on the experiences and reflections of women who are convicted under joint enterprise laws in the UK. And we're going to do that with the group of us, which consists of families of women who are convicted under joint enterprise laws, campaigners and researchers, all who have been involved in the research project called Stories of Injustice, which you can see on the screen at the moment. Just to introduce myself, I'm Catherine Chadwick, and I work in the sociology department at Manchester Metropolitan University in the UK. Round the table today, and our contributors, as I've just indicated, we've got family members, we've got campaigners, and my co-researcher. So we've got Claire and Dave Warren, we've got Jo Barr, we've got Jan Cunliffe, Gloria Morrison, and Becky Clark. What will happen is, as each of them speak, rather than me introduce them now at this early stage, as each of them speak, they will just say a little bit about themselves and who they are and why they're part of the round table. Stories of Injustice, so the report that we published in November, December in 2020. Stories of Injustice reveals the voices of women convicted under joint enterprise laws in England and Wales. many for serious violent offences that they did not commit. In order to understand how and why that happens and why it continues to happen, what we would suggest is that you go to the link that we've got on this slide and you have a look at the report. We can't go into all that detail in this session, but please go and read the report. What we found was that the silencing and marginalisation of women's voices and their stories in joint enterprise trials contributes to a much wider silencing of the failure of state institutions to both protect and to care for girls and women. So the focus of this session is to explore the significance and the value of collective, collaborative research, and I guess most importantly, action, as it's experienced from the viewpoint of different collaborators and the potential that that has for change. Before we go on to look at the questions that we want to explore, I wanted to just very, very, very briefly start by placing all of this into some broader context. Let me just see if I can move my slide on. Doesn't want to move on. No. There we go. Yeah, I just wanted to say a little bit and to place what we're going to do tonight in this broader context of the centrality, I think, for us, particularly as researchers, of what we call critical interventionist research. Critical interventionist research informs the ongoing work of a collective that is based in Manchester. And if we look on the first slide again, alongside the stories of injustice, the link to Gender Campaign, which will become apparent as we get into the discussion. We also have a collective called Sites of Resistance, and there are a set of principles that we work by, and I just wanted to very quickly share those with you before we get into the discussion, so you can really see where we're coming from with this work. Firstly, positionality, our position, the need in all of the work that we do to challenge silencing and othering. And there are a whole range of strategies that we can use in order to do that. Alongside that, the need to challenge state institutional power, the need to expose, to demystify, to interject destructive policies and practices which marginalise particular individuals, groups, and communities. On our website, we have a couple of quotes that I've taken to illustrate some of these points. As researchers, we share a responsibility to expose, resist, and alleviate injustice. In particular, that which manifests in gross social, economic, and political inequalities, resulting in mass criminalisation and imprisonment. And then, of course, there are the strategies, the interventions, how we move forward. This isn't just about the research, but it's also how we move forward. So the significance of ensuring that knowledge must be active in seeking to expose and disrupt inequalities and injustice. The need to prioritise collective collaborations, and this is very much what this session is about and what we want to explore, the significance of collaborative work in thinking through ideas, and again, very importantly, action strategies and interventions. So again, we say these ambitions can only be realised when researchers, campaigners, activists, and community or policy work is located and responsive to the community. So hopefully that sets a bit of context about who we are, where we're coming from, what our priorities are. I think in the information that you got about this session, these 3 questions that we would like to explore in the main part of this session are outlined here. And we're going to do that. We're going to look at these 3 questions: why collaborative, what we know, and what next. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to attempt to lead the discussion. There are quite a few of us who are wanting to contribute. Everybody who you can see here can talk an awful lot about this subject area. So let's get going, let's get started. And I'm going to first of all ask Jan. I can't see Jan at the moment, but I'm sure she is there. First of all, in thinking about again, just setting some context, I'd like Jan just to very briefly give us a description of what joint enterprise is, what it means.
Right. Can you hear me? Yeah.
We can.
Yeah, right. I'm not going to do it in a legal way because obviously that'll become confusing, but joint enterprise basically means if there's a crime committed by one person, as a legal principle, the courts and the CPS can charge multiple people and blame them for that single crime. So, for instance, if someone shoots someone, and he's got him or he, she have got friends, and you can be associated with the person who's done the shooting, whether that's just being at the scene at the time or receiving a phone call before or afterwards, or living in the same house with them, or dropping them off in a car 10 minutes before or picking them up 10 minutes afterwards. It doesn't mean that the evidence that is put through the trial process is actually evidence of your assisting, the offender, or supplying the gun, or telling them to actually go and shoot someone. So you don't really need there isn't in this country, we don't use we don't use evidence that shows that you've had a plan and that you've all, you're all in it together and you've all made this wonderful plan that you're going to go out there and commit this crime, and you all play a different part. In the UK, our courts don't need to prove necessarily what your part is, and we put people in prison at the moment for what they describe as the possibility of foresight, that you may foresee what another person's actions would be in any given situation, whether that's because someone throws a punch in a 10-second affray and the person that is punched dies. If you're with the person who throws the punch, then you're supposed to have this foresight that this could lead to the other person dying. So for us, it's a common law. In England, it's a common law, and it doesn't make any common sense. And I suppose if you're in America, the closest thing that you could compare it to would be the law of parties or the felony murder rule. But at least yours has some kind of legislation attached to it, and some, makes some sense in this country because it's a common law. Each case that goes by and each case that uses very low level evidence allows the next case that comes along. So if you've got a case where someone's found guilty because they're just present at the scene, then that goes into the case that follows. That mere presence alone isn't enough to convict, or it didn't used to be, but now it is. So joint enterprise over the space of 30 years, has been diluted to such a degree that any one of us in this meeting right now, if we were somewhere in this country and there was a fight or an altercation and one of your friends killed someone because they'd had a fight, all of us could be found guilty should the CPS in this country want to find you guilty. And one of the other things that we need to focus on as well, because it's a common law, because there isn't any structure to it, any definite structure to it, it's all about association. So what the courts do is they use young people. If there's a crime committed and they don't actually know who's done it, but they know there's a group of young people there at the scene, they'll call it a gang. So they'll use a gang narrative, and therefore you're all a criminal gang, so you're all in it together. So you must all be guilty. And we found, I mean, Becky can tell you, after a report she did a few years ago, and the research we've done as well, and the amount of people that we support. This is a racist law. It's used against Black people, and it's easy to use against Black people because when you attach a gang narrative to an altercation or a death, the public are much more likely to believe that this is the right way to go about it. And the most important thing that we've got to recognise as well, myself and Gloria had never heard of joint enterprise 12, 15 years ago. We only heard about joint enterprise because someone that we loved and cared about was convicted of a joint enterprise murder. And up until that point, we'd never heard of joint enterprise. And that's quite telling because the British public are completely unaware. They have no idea that there's a common law in this country that can put you into prison for a life sentence. And a life sentence in this country is 99 years, even though we get a minimum term. But you're under license for 99 years. People in this country don't realise that exists. And one of the reasons you can get that life sentence is because you may have a possibility of foresight. You may foresee what someone else might do. And that is ridiculous.
Jan, can I just stop you there? That's fantastic. Do you want to say, just very briefly, any more about who you are? Oh, I forgot to ask. Just very briefly.
I'll put myself in context. Me and Gloria Morrison in 2000, we met in, I think, 2008, 2009, after a panorama programme featured both of our sons. So my son was convicted of murder in 2008. He was 15 years old. It was a one-blow incident where the victim died because of one single injury, which was to the neck. 3 teenagers were sentenced to life imprisonment for his murder, even though most people would argue it was manslaughter. And my son at the time didn't lay a finger on the victim, was completely unaware of the incident. And the reason for that was because he was blind at the time. So he couldn't see what was happening around him. And yet the trial process thought that it was okay to, use that he should have foreseen what others would do, even though he couldn't see the actions of others in the first place. So that's what triggered me to want to know more about joint enterprise, triggered me to want to know if this had happened to other people. And that's when I came into contact with Gloria.
Thanks, Jan. So Gloria, could you just very briefly introduce yourself and then perhaps just talk about how the project Stories of Injustice was conceived in the context of GEMBA as a campaigning organisation?
All right, thank you, Catherine. My name's Gloria Morrison. I'm the campaign coordinator for GEMBA, only because we needed a role for somebody to do something. We're very grassroots. We've come from, like Jan said, her and I meeting each other and just been really shocked that you could get a life sentence for something you actually hadn't done. My story is that it was my son's best friend, so it's not actually a family member, but I call him my son. He was a 19-year-old Black young man, and when he got convicted of murder that he didn't, and the judge accepted he hadn't murdered anyone, I instinctively knew it was racist. So one of GEMBA's kind of points has always been that this law discriminates against certain communities, especially working class and Black and ethnic minority communities. When we launched our campaign in 2010, we launched having the support of, we were supporting 160 prisoners, because there's a prison newspaper in England called Inside Times. So we put an advert in there saying we're convicted of joint enterprise. We are now supporting over 1,000 prisoners, the youngest being just 13 when he was given a life sentence, and a girl actually was 13 when she was given a life sentence. Because what people don't realise, in 2006 we brought in mandatory sentences, so the judges don't have any discretion anymore. If you're convicted of a murder, you must have a mandatory sentence. So over the years, in terms of grassroots campaigning and building momentum and trying to kind of knock on doors and chip away, we have had lots of academic support now. We've had a lot of political support in terms of, you know, families that won't give up on their loved ones because they're serving life sentences for something they haven't actually done. But one of the things that really bugged us as a campaign, or me and Jan in particular, was the women's cases, because the tropes that are used in the courtroom for joint enterprise or for any kind of conviction, because we've got to remember that it's an adversarial system here. It's absolutely about getting a win. It's not about getting justice. It's about getting a win in the courtroom, and that's what the prosecution want. And these are very highly educated, often Oxford and Cambridge prosecutors who are talking to young people in a way that there's no way a young person can understand what they're saying to them, or any marginalised kid or anyone who's never been in the court system before, because a lot of our prisoners have never had any criminal engagement with the criminal justice system. So you don't go from someone who has no criminal background to being a murderer, but we have a lot of people in that bracket. So but the women's cases kind of threw up different parts of these tropes, that, you know, that they were much more marginalized, that they hadn't committed any violence whatsoever, which the report explained, and that they were just really lost voices in the system, because actually for some reason, which is also historical, women are treated worse. You know, like if you're a murderer, a female murderer, you're treated worse. So it was something after Becky and Patrick Williams did a report about racism and joint enterprise, which was proven, we then kind of, you know, badgered a little bit, and luckily Catherine and Becky got to do this Stories of Injustice, which is about women and joint enterprise, and it did flag up all the other things that's wrong with joint enterprise, but just focusing on women was a very, very clear-cut way of saying, not only is the law wrong, not only is it over-criminalising innocent people, but Jengba have been, you know, right all along, because when we got to the Supreme Court in 2016, and a case called R versus Jogi, they said, oh, the law had taken a wrong turn in 1984, because we've been relying, the court's been relying on what Jan mentioned earlier was foresight, and we have to go back to intention. You've got to prove what someone's intentions. They haven't, and they're still not. So that's why we really knew there was a need to look at the women's cases, and thankfully Catherine and Becky were allowed to do that in their report.
Thanks, Gloria. Can I turn now to Becky, who is one of the co-researchers. Becky, you might just want to introduce yourself and perhaps just talk a little bit about how the project developed and how the collaborative elements of the project began to develop.
Sure, I'm sure for others in the session, you know, wherever you're based in the world, you'll probably connect to my reflection that this project could only have ever been done if it was done in the collaborative way that we did it. So I'm a researcher, and I've been an applied researcher for many years, for over 20 years in criminal justice. But, you know, the last 7 or 8 years, especially when you're trying to open up and examine issues of injustice, they are necessarily hidden by the state. So your strategies to identify and to connect with and to gather evidence and understanding and energy and commitment to kind of challenging those injustices has to be collaborative. So, you know, Catherine and I, whilst we brought our skills to bear, hopefully on the project, without Jembo, without the families, so Joe and Claire and Dave who were here, who all took part, as did their daughters, and you know, without those women in the prison, finding other women in the prison, because the state in the UK does not want us to know about joint enterprise, so it doesn't record it anywhere, it doesn't provide any official information. So we only know how many people are convicted under joint enterprise if they can't contact the campaign or if they are found by other prisoners. So the research identified 109 women convicted under joint enterprise, which I recognise, particularly on the scale of imprisonment in the United States, may not sound that many, but actually to find over 100 lifers in the British system when we have less than 4,000 women in prison, and to find over 100 of them on life sentences for murder and manslaughter, average of 16 years, when they haven't committed any violence, is a very, you know, significant thing, but it's not something we're meant to know. So as Catherine opened, the idea of working collaboratively in order to kind of bear witness to this pain, to this injustice, to the harms of these punishments, really requires the campaign as a central space to bring people together. It requires the families and prisoners and others having trust in the process that they will share those experiences with us, and it will, you know, bring about some sense of purpose and in you know, in effect change, because ultimately, and I'm sure we'll hear this in a moment, you know, the families want their loved ones home. You know, we're in the middle of a global pandemic, and you know, the situation is more urgent than ever. So it was absolutely about collaborating with the campaigners, the families and the women in prison first. But there's also, if we were a round table and we were to bring together everybody who collaborated, it'd be a huge table, because we had a fantastic advisory group, a group of critical friends. And it's interesting because, you know, at a practical, pragmatic level, we might say we want to change the law, or we want to have more effective appeals to bring women home, and that is absolutely a practical need. But there's also a more radical ambition that is to abolish the joint enterprise law and actually to contribute to a conversation about prison abolition and the abolition of criminalisation and punishment more widely. And our advisory group really demonstrate that broad sort of section of critical friends, because we had lawyers on there, some of the most you know, well-known lawyers in the country, in the UK, so Harriet Wistrich, Felicity Gerry, Simon Natus, Naima Sakande from Appeal, you know, so we had some excellent legals. And the conversations are difficult at times, because those are legal practitioners invested in a system and invested with good intention to change that system. But ultimately, there are others on the advisory group who want to abolish that system. But that range of voices collaborating, we had a politician, a member of parliament who had been actually my constituency MP, who had been very committed to supporting 12 young men, boys and young men from my constituency, who had been sentenced to 168 years in prison, and she came on board from that case. Other MPs have spoken. So we have this collaboration that starts with the campaign and the families and the prisoners, but we want practical outcomes. We want innocent girls and women home, but we also want more radical outcomes. And so we've had this collaboration that has been challenging, but I think hugely positive. And you know, I feel very privileged to have been part of this collaboration with all those people involved.
Thanks, Becky. Can I turn to Claire and Dave and Jo as family members, each of you with daughters who are currently serving joint enterprise convictions, sentences, and perhaps ask you to just reflect a little bit on, excuse me, your own involvement when you became involved in the campaign, when you became involved in the research project, and how that felt for you as families and parents. Perhaps Dave and Claire, do you want to go first?
Yeah, okay. Hi, everyone. Hope you're all staying safe and well. So we're Claire and Dave Warren. We're the parents of Zoe Warren, who was convicted of a joint enterprise murder, which she didn't commit. And she was sentenced to 17 years minimum life term. So we feel, she's a victim of joint enterprise and a miscarriage of justice. And I think it's important to say that from the outset. For us, how we got involved, it's a little bit like I think someone mentioned earlier about joint enterprise. Glo and Jan mentioned, we never heard of joint enterprise. No one really knows about it. You stick your head in the sand here in the UK because it doesn't affect you. So why should you bother? As soon as you're in that sphere of joint enterprise, the whole world changes. And so you start reaching out and finding out a bit more about it, especially when you feel aggrieved about the whole process, the police investigation process, and the court process. Our deeply suspicious of the police. 1 minute, Zoe's a prosecution witness, the main prosecution witness. She previously saved the victim's life a few hours early before the incident, the murder, performed CPR and saved his life. And then she's going to be a prosecution main witness. And then on someone else's saying she confessed murder, suddenly she then becomes charged with murder. So you become deeply suspicious of that. And then you get to the court, and you start to hear things, and you don't hear the whole story, and people aren't telling the truth, and you're suspicious of things. And when you walk out that door, you go, wow. So you start reaching around to look for places to find out where you can get the information from. And we found Jengba, and we spoke to Gloria and Jan, and thankfully they were there. They're sort of the life buoy there to assist you and pull you in, because you've obviously jumped ship sort of thing, and you want to get back on board and sort your life out. And so we just really we got involved with Jengba, and then they introduced us to Catherine and Becky, who were conducting the Stories of Injustice project. And so we really sort of engaged with them. We were deeply suspicious of the whole thing, not what they're doing, but what the police were doing. So we wanted to tell our story and tell Zoe's story, importantly, because Zoe's like, what? No one believed me. No one wanted to hear my story in court. So why? I need to tell people. And Gloria, Jan, Becky and Catherine, they're some of the women who believed in Zoe. And that's very important, because Zoe wasn't believed and still felt she wasn't believed. No one would. Because once, you're a convicted murderer, no one wants to know who you are. You go into the silent realms of, you're parked somewhere in the UK in a prison. No one wants to know about you, and you're scum. And that's it. Forget about us and everyone else around you, and you're thinking, hang on, that's not right. So got involved with Becky and Catherine. They got involved, told us about the Stories of Injustice. We, went along and, helped and gave our story and the information we had. And then it sort of gathered momentum. And at the time, we just really wanted to, that's what we kind of, we expected to be able to tell our story, and so more importantly for Zoe to have a voice and be able to say her thing, because she wanted to be able to say, hey guys, look, I'm a human being. I'm stuck in somewhere that I didn't do this. You got to believe me. Every statement, I've seen all the statements, didn't do it. I was terrified. That's not taken into account. And so she wanted to feel to be part, when the Stories of Injustice project was gathering momentum and stuff, she wanted to be a part of something, to be able to tell her story, but also, as she says, there are other people out there, who talk to her, and so that's what she wanted to do, wasn't it, Claire?
Yeah, and I also think with Zoe, it's really important that there was a lot went on before the incident, which ended up with Zoe being convicted of murder. There was a lot happening in Zoe's earlier life, as with a lot of women. There's a long story, very, very sad stories about what happens prior to the incident, which leads them to end up in prison. And ultimately, it's a failing of many different organisations, many different services, who, if they had believed these women in the first place or had assisted as they should do, then a lot of these women may never have been led to the circumstances and been in the situations which ultimately have put them in this horrendous situation now.
I think you just cut adrift, aren't you? That's,
Yeah. And there is a lot more, behind all of these women and men. There's some very, very, very sad stories. And you know we don't just speak for Zoe when we talk about that. We're speaking for everyone. We only know the deep facts about Zoe's case, but this is to help everyone, not just Zoe.
Exactly. That's us.
Thank you so much, both of you. I can't imagine how difficult it is for you to, you know, to be recounting everything that's happened, and we, you know, so grateful for you to be here talking to us. Joe, is there anything you'd like to add in terms of introducing yourself and how you became involved in Gender and in the Stories of Injustice project? Joe, you need to try and unmute yourself. Great.
I'm Joe. I'm the mum of 2 daughters. I've only got 2 children, and that's them. 11 years ago this year, their dad got killed in what used to be our family home. My girls were in another room. It was Ashley's fiance that did it. He admitted it straight away. The girls at the police station were told, go home, and Ashley was told in the beginning that she was going to be charged with robbery, but then you can't be charged with stealing your own property or breaking into your own property. And so they came up with this joint enterprise, which we'd never heard of, and they didn't use joint enterprise in the beginning. It was a secondary party, and I think that's how they mask it and get around it. Anyway, my girls were convinced that they were coming home because they hadn't done anything wrong. They hadn't killed their dad, and they both got found guilty of murder. The gentleman that killed their dad, he got a 22-year sentence, as did my eldest daughter, who didn't kill anybody, and my youngest daughter got a 18-year sentence, both with a life license. My eldest daughter was 18 at the time, and my youngest daughter was 16. But yeah, it's tough. I also got charged with attempting to pervert the course of justice. So I've also been inside the prison system, so I know how it works, etc., but not as much as the people that have been there a lot longer than I was. Upon release, my girls told me about Genva, so I contacted them, and they've been so supportive and helpful, and you know, we get together as often as we can, and we try to put it out there in the public domain, because so many people do not believe. I remember going on my first campaign to get signatures, and I said to one gentleman, excuse me, he said, what are you doing? I said, we're getting signatures. What for? Well, there's innocent people in prison. And he said to me, yeah, but not in this country. I said, oh yes, there is. And I explained it to him. He said, give it here. And then he took it round and got everybody else to sign it as well. So that's how I became involved, because of my girls. Never had anything to do with the law beforehand. And I also think if you've not had anything to do with the law, that goes in the prosecution's favour, because they know you don't know, and they know they can hoodwink you. So
again, thanks very much, Joe, for that contribution. I'm very conscious of the time, and that we have got just over 15 minutes left. I think in what everybody's talked about so far, I think one of the really significant things is that so little is known about joint enterprise. Various of you have said it's something that is hidden, the silencing, but the lack of understanding until you're actually put in the position of being confronted by joint enterprise. It's very difficult, or it's impossible to understand or to know of its existence. And if it's okay with everybody, I'd like to move us on slightly, because I think we've, to a certain extent, addressed some of the second question in terms of what we know. And perhaps just the second part of that second question relates to processes of dissemination. And I think that's a really important part of this process that we've been going through, is how we get this hidden message out, in the hope that we have some positive action. And I know that all of you have been involved in different aspects of dissemination, whether that's with the media, whether it's with writing, whether it's podcasts, or whatever it may be. There's all sorts of dissemination taking place. And I guess just some reflections maybe from each of you, just some short reflections, whether that's positive things that have come from dissemination or barriers to dissemination. I mean, maybe if I just go round as I see you, so maybe start with Becky.
Thanks, Catherine. I mean, as I was listening to Claire and Dave and Joe there, that was very much something I was thinking, you know, in terms of how do we get these hidden messages out? And, you know, Gemba, the campaign, which is, you know, the centre of it is Gloria and Jan as the co-founders, but it is absolutely a network of families. So it's Joe and Claire and Dave, and it's also that wider network of academics, of legals, of documentary filmmakers, of journalists, of politicians, of anybody who will kind of become Jengba'd, as it were, and get involved. But you know, even with this huge sort of collective energy and effort, it's like pushing a boulder uphill, because every time you feel that you're getting some traction, you're getting some movement of that boulder, you feel the pressure pushing back down on it. And I think that was definitely what we experienced in November of last year when we launched the report. And we had some amazing media interest in the UK. So, I mean, I'm guessing our kind of global audience will have heard of BBC, or will have heard of, so we were on the Women's Hour, which is one of, you know, millions of listeners on the radio, on the BBC. We did some BBC News, we did some, but even in those spaces, there was this repeated pushback of, actually, could we have a more sympathetic story? We're not sure if legally we want to kind of challenge these injustices so openly. It may seem biased to challenge the system. It's not fair, it's not equitable to challenge the system. And I think that for me, this is what is so challenging, and I'm sure it's the same in the United States, in Australia, New Zealand, you know, and further into countries where those media forums and spaces, you know, maybe less established. It's so difficult to get powerful voices, or you know, those people who are the gatekeepers to audiences, to stand with us. It feels as if we're often challenging that. And you know, I'd probably really, I know that Claire and Dave particularly have had such harrowing experiences with the media, that even to step out again and try and engage with the media feels like a real risk to take, but it also feels like one that you have to do, because otherwise how do you get out there? So I'd maybe stop there and pass to you guys, Claire and Dave.
Yeah, I mean, thankfully the Stories of Injustice, when the launch was there, we were lucky to present to the House of Commons, to MPs there, you know, and another audience, and that generated interest in Zoe's case, you know, and we're lucky now that likes of Appeal are looking at Zoe's case and want to look at it from scratch, if you like, along with the Innocence Project in London. But, you know, there's a lot of negatives. Zoe was demonized. She was an evil temptress, party girl. There's various documentaries and articles. There's a documentary called Killer Girlfriends. I mean, that's, you know, that's your daughter, you know, and so, you know, that it's not good. And this demonization of women before they're even, you know, we even know what's happened. And the poor women are getting demonized because of there being a female. You know, there's very quickly, the last thing I'm going to say is an article in the paper yesterday. There's a case going on here in the UK, and the prosecution say to the woman, because it's a woman and a man co-accused, did you have sex with that man? And that's the kind of thing they ask Zoe in the court as well. They don't ask the men that, but they do it with the women, you know, and it's one of those little things where it's about, they pile pressure on a woman, you know, because a woman's got to be an evil temptress. But that's where I'm going to stop it now. I'm sorry. Thank you.
Anybody else want to say anything about dissemination before we move? Yeah, Glo.
Just really quickly, I think because we've got a very wide audience, if you went back to Jordan Cunliffe's case, I'm not going to mention the newspaper because we don't say that word in this country. Well, campaigners don't, but it's Murdoch's paper. He was calling for the death penalty to be brought back, and he was using that case to justify that we needed the death penalty brought back. So that was only 15, not that long ago, that we feel that, we are controlled so by the media to tell us what we need as a justice system and what we need to correct our justice is to basically kill 15-year-old blind boys that haven't actually committed a crime. And that's exactly where we are now. Nothing has changed because our media right now has done exactly what it did to Zoe, exactly what it did to Joe and Holly and Ashley and Jordan. It has, nothing has changed. Sorry, but I really want people to get angry about this because especially what's going on politically over here right now and all the crap that we're witnessing, and everyone's just going, oh, okay, that's all right. But they will ignore it in terms of criminal justice. And now we've got this bill that they're trying to bring in, which is the police and crime, and they're trying to hype up sentencing, and they're doing it sneakily. So everyone has to be more angry. I say this many times when I do talks, as you know, Catherine, Becky. I don't want to go on too much because I know we're really limited for time, but it is to do with our media. It is how women are presented. It is how cases are presented, especially in joint enterprise. They're all gangs, they're all feral, but actually look at what the government's doing right now. That's a gang, that's feral, that's broken.
Thanks, Gloria. Okay, I'm going to move on to the final section, which is very much about how we move forward and what our priorities are moving forward. And I want to start off with Joe and Claire and Dave from a family point of view, but also from your girls and your daughters' points of view, in terms of, what do families want? What do the women want? What is needed? How do we move forward?
Joe, do you want to lead with that?
Do you want me to go first? Sorry.
Go on, Joe. Yeah.
Yeah, Joe.
Yeah. My girls think that, they need to come home, but also after the Joker judgment in 2016, they printed in the press hundreds of murderers to walk free, which then knocked everything back. And that's what causes the uphill struggle. But last year, I think it was, my daughter said if they offered her a plea bargain for manslaughter, she would accept it because she's done 10 years and she'd be home. But what I think they need to do is abolish the life license, because it's that gets everybody, because that's what makes them into a revolving door and they can't breathe without probation being on their case and on their backs. And it's probation that ruins your life when you've done your time. They just hold you back all the time. And they find obstacles. Well, you can't do this, you can't do A because of B. And if you do B, then you've got C. And they're constantly finding. And that's what makes it difficult, the life license. It's as bad as giving the death penalty, because you can't live your life because you're not allowed to, because probation say you can't. And they're watching you and monitoring you. No, that's what we need to get rid of. The life license. Sorry, guys.
Thanks, Joe.
Claire, you mentioned about the women. You mentioned about the women, didn't you? Before the charge, got the charge, or
yeah,
they want to be believed or something.
I think for us, obviously exactly the same as Joe.
Yeah.
What do we want, and what we want for everyone who's wrongly convicted? They need to be home. Like somebody said earlier, somebody needs to stand up and listen to the facts of the cases. The cases need to be investigated thoroughly, because we're all in this position because the cases were not investigated thoroughly. They were wrongly convicted when the court only heard a fraction of the evidence, a fraction, and even some of the evidence that was given was manipulated in order to get the conviction. It's a target rate of conviction. Zoe wants to be home, Zoe wants to be listened to, and Zoe wants her story and all the other women's stories to be heard, and to be heard in full, because that's the problem. Everybody, if I listen to Zoe's, if I read a newspaper about Zoe's case, I do not recognise Zoe's case. If I watch a programme about Zoe's case, I do not recognise Zoe's case. There is no truth in what we are reading, and it's about getting the women's voices heard and the men's voices too, because I feel extremely guilty when I just say the women, but everybody who's wrongly convicted has a right to have their story told and heard and listened to and treated with the, you know, that they need to be treated with the respect. We're all human beings at the end of the day, and you know, Zoe's done nothing wrong, you know, and she shouldn't be where she is, and we just need more people to do what all of yourselves are doing, to believe.
Yeah.
Catherine, should we share Zoe's recent email as well? Sorry, I'm just aware of time, and I really think, you know, the room would...
Do you want me to read that now?
I think so, yeah. So Claire and Dave's daughter Zoe is, I think it's fair to say she has grown into the campaign as well, because she was a young girl when she went to prison, and you know, we'd had contact with her early on in this project, but actually just this week she sent a letter in for this event, and I just think, you know, it shows her process of growing into the campaign. Sorry, Catherine, thanks.
Yeah, so you can see here we've copied Zoe's letter, which I think she sent to her mum and dad, Dave and Claire, yesterday. And this is an extract which I'll just read out for you. It gives me a lot of hope and comfort knowing people believe my story and can see the effect it has on people. I have met so many women in similar circumstances as myself. Lives are ruined by this law. At court throughout my trial, I was hopeful for once that the justice system will actually bring justice. Only that never happened, and yet again, I was let down by the system. My case wasn't looked into properly, and I know if it was, I wouldn't be writing this letter right now. Having people like yourselves study stories like mine gives me hope that one day joint enterprise will no longer be a thing of today's justice system. And I think what that shows very clearly is what Dave and Claire and Joe have just been saying about the need for people to believe in the stories, to believe in the campaign. One of our research participants, Freya, said that although the justice system brought me to justice, it has not served justice. Before I just move on to the final slide and some concluding comments, just like to turn to Gloria and to Jan, and just to ask the question again, sort of thinking about how we move forward. You know, what does the campaign want? How can people who are potentially in this international audience, how can people help? Is this about reform? Is it about abolition? Is it about sort of more collective, collaborative working? How do we move forward with this?
Jan?
Well, it's got to be abolition, because if we go back to Derek Bentley in the 1950s, his was a joint enterprise case, and it was the felony murder rule that led to him being hung for a murder he didn't commit. So 40, 50 years ago, we abolished a law that was incorrect, that allowed a teenager to be hung and given the death penalty. And although we're not hanging teenagers now, we might as well be, because we're giving them life sentences for less than what Derek Bentley did in the 1950s. So it has to be abolished. If the felony murder rule was abolished, then joint enterprise has to be abolished. We have to use real evidence, concrete evidence, beyond all reasonable doubt, not notions of foresight and gang affiliation. If you're a murderer and you've murdered someone, only then should you be called a convicted murderer. If you haven't murdered anyone, you can't go to prison for a life sentence and be called a murderer, because that's not what you are. That is a complete and utter lie. And I think the way this has been a bit of a bugbear for me for a long time. The victim's wife in our case, in our particular case, was made a baroness. So she's now a member of the House of Lords. So it's been very difficult for me and for Jengba to get the truth out there, because when you've got a baroness in the House of Lords milling around with the judges and the politicians and the people who make the law change in this country, it's very difficult for us to make a law change. She was then made the Victims Commissioner of England and Wales. So all victims of all crime were sent to her, and she tried to make sentences harder. She even engaged with the Sun newspaper to bring back the death penalty, all of those things. So why not let's have a defendants commissioner? Why don't we have that? Why don't we have someone for the people who are in prison who shouldn't be there to have a voice for these people, so that that person can talk to the politicians and to the members of the House of Lords, so that there's some kind of balance, so that, you know, they say sort of with politics that there has to be an opposite and there has to be a mirror of each role that people play. But when it comes to legal matters, there is no balance, there is no mirror image. So we have a victims commissioner, but we don't have a defendants commissioner.
Jan,
we have a Ministry of Justice, but we don't have a Ministry of Injustice.
Can I just interrupt? Jan, I just want to just finish something up quickly, because I don't know how, we got minutes left. I just want to say that for anyone watching this, and I have put it in the chat, that we hold ourselves up as the British justice system as being the world, but it hasn't. It's colonialised. Joint enterprises in America, it's in Australia. It's not in America, it's felony murder in America, but it's in Australia, it's in the West Indies. So it was used as a way, as like the British being, you know, the best in the world at law and order and stuff like that. Root and branch abolition, it does not suit this country anymore, because there is not a man judge in this country that understands what it's like to live on a West London council estate or a Moss Side estate. They don't understand that life. And unless we get that, unless we get looked at by our peers, justice system that is by our peers, abolition. We cannot carry on locking up 17-year-old kids, and they are now locking them up, and they, because of COVID, they're not going to get tried. They're on remand. They're not going to get tried to 2023. Innocent young kids. Sorry. Abolition.
Abolition, yes.
I'm conscious that people are leaving because the time's over. But I think it's important to end on this absolute demand for abolition, because that's what this conference is set up for, imagining abolition. But I also want to say that, you know, for Catherine and I, this quote by Angela Davis, who helps us all to imagine abolition of prisons and punishment, shows us that in the process of battling together, we often feel we don't win, or we're pushed back on that boulder, or we're not making progress. But the one thing Catherine and I feel, and I know we share it with you guys, is that actually the process of fighting together has been so valuable. And of course, we want those outcomes and those endpoints. But, you know, and I see it in Zoe's letter, that being believed, finding love, humanity, trust, belief in each other is so important along the way, isn't it?
Yeah.
You know.
Okay, just to very quickly wrap it up. I don't know if Laura wants to come back in, but just to thank everybody who has attended on behalf of us all. Thank you very much for all those who attended. And what we really would urge you to do is to look at the links that are in the slides, to look at the links that have been put in the chat. Get onto the Jengba website and support in whatever way, and spread the word in whatever way you possibly can. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
We would like to give you all a great round of applause. Thank you so much for joining us. And just for anyone who would like to save the links, if you press on the 3 dots at the bottom of the chat, you're able to save the links. So if you have time to check those out. So thank you all. That was very insightful. Thank you for joining us. Hope to see you all at the next presentation.
Thank you. Thanks,
Thank you,
Laura
Laura,
and
very
Ryan.
much.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Bye-bye.
Panelists.